You wake up before the sun. Not because of an alarm, there isn't one. You wake up because the light changes, because the air is still cool, because if you wait any longer, the heat will already be pressing down on the mud brick walls around you. Now imagine you are a woman living in the Persian Empire, somewhere around 2,500 years ago. Not a queen, not a princess, just a woman with a household, or a workshop, or a field waiting for her attention. What does the next 12 hours actually look like? It's a strange question because when most people picture ancient Persia, they picture kings, Darius on his throne, Xerxes crossing into Greece, immortal soldiers in gold jewelry. Nobody pictures the woman grinding grain before dawn, or the one walking to a workshop to weave, or the one supervising 40 other women on a royal estate and being paid more than the men working beside her. That last detail is real. And it's the kind of detail that doesn't survive in the stories we usually tell about this empire. It survives somewhere else entirely, in thousands of small clay tablets buried under a palace floor that nobody was ever supposed to read again. So today, we're going to answer a simple question with a complicated answer. What did an ordinary Persian woman actually do all day? Let's start with where the evidence even comes from, because this matters more than usual. Most of what we think we know about ancient women comes from men writing about women, usually elite men, usually writing about elite women, and usually writing centuries after the fact. Ancient Persia is a little different. In the early 1930s, archaeologists excavating the ceremonial capital of Persepolis uncovered a cache of administrative tablets written in Elamite cuneiform that had nothing to do with kings or conquests. They were payroll records, ration lists, travel permits, bureaucratic paperwork from the reign of Darius I, roughly 509 to 494 BCE. Historians call them the Persepolis fortification tablets, and they are one of the strangest gifts an ancient civilization ever left behind because they weren't written to impress anyone. Nobody carved them into a monument. Nobody expected them to be read by us. They were simply the working records of an empire feeding and paying its labor force, and because of that, they tell us something the monuments never could, what ordinary people, including ordinary women, were actually doing. So picture your morning again, but through the lens of these records. If you were an ordinary Persian woman working within the empire's labor system, you likely belonged to a category the tablets call kurtash, a term that roughly translates to worker or laborer, and it applied to both men and women. You were not a slave in the way that term is often used today, but you were not fully free either. You worked in exchange for rations, grain, wine or beer, and sometimes fruit, distributed according to a scale that took into account your role, your skill, and in some cases, your family status. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people the most. Women in these labor gangs were paid, not symbolically, actual rations, actual wages in kind, recorded individually by name or by group, month after month, in the same administrative system that tracked payments to men. That alone reframes the picture. This wasn't a society where women's labor was invisible or unrecognized by the state. It was counted, measured, and compensated, at least within this formal economic system tied to royal and satrapal estates. So what were these women actually doing? The tablets describe several categories of female labor. A significant number of women worked in textile production, spinning and weaving wool, and, in some cases, more valuable materials for the empire's vast need for cloth. Others worked in food processing, grinding grain into flour, an exhausting, repetitive task that could occupy hours of a single day using a stone quern. Still others worked directly in agriculture, tending vineyards, orchards, and fields tied to royal or elite estates. Now picture the grinding stone for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. Grain doesn't turn into usable flour on its own. Before ovens and bread, someone has to kneel or crouch over a stone surface and physically crush the kernels over and over for as long as it takes to produce enough flour to feed a household or a labor crew. Archaeologists have found grinding stones at sites across the Persian world, worn smooth on one side from decades of exactly this motion. It is one of the most physically demanding, least glamorous jobs imaginable, and for enormous numbers of women across the ancient world, including Persia, it was simply part of the morning, every morning, for most of a lifetime. But the tablets reveal something even more unexpected than the labor itself. They reveal a hierarchy within it. Some women held supervisory roles. The Elamite term used in the tablets, arashara, is generally translated as something like chief or overseer, and it appears attached to women who managed groups of other female workers. These overseers received higher ration allotments than the women working under them, sometimes higher than male workers doing comparable supervisory jobs elsewhere in the system. Historian Maria Brosius, who has spent much of her career studying women in the Achaemenid Persian world, has pointed to this evidence as proof that female labor wasn't just tolerated within the imperial economy, it was organized, ranked, and in specific cases, rewarded with genuine authority over a workforce. A woman could be, in a very real administrative sense, someone's boss. That doesn't mean Persian society treated women and men identically. It almost certainly didn't. But it complicates the flat assumption that ancient women were universally confined to an invisible domestic sphere with no formal economic role. In at least this documented slice of Achaemenid life, women were workers, earners, and in some cases, managers within a massive state-run labor economy. There's another detail in the tablets that deserves its own moment because it's easy to walk past. Pregnant and nursing women appear in the ration records receiving increased allotments. The system didn't just track who worked, it tracked who was pregnant and adjusted their pay in kind accordingly, presumably to account for the physical demands of both labor and childbirth recovery. It's a small, bureaucratic line in a clay tablet, but it implies something worth sitting with. An administrative system that acknowledged pregnancy as a condition requiring additional resources, rather than something to be quietly absorbed into an unchanged workload. We should be careful here, because it would be easy to romanticize this. We don't know if this adjustment reflected genuine care or simply a practical calculation to keep a laborer productive. Ancient bureaucracies rarely explain their own motives. The tablets tell us what happened. They don't tell us why. Now, everything we've described so far applies to women working within this formal labor system, tied to royal or elite estates, mostly in and around the empire's administrative heartland in Persia proper, what is now southwestern Iran. This is a crucial distinction, and it's one historians are careful to make. The Persepolis fortification tablets capture a specific slice of the empire, a specific economic system over a specific 20-year window. They do not describe every woman across an empire that, at its height, stretched from the Balkans to the Indus River, encompassing dozens of cultures, languages, and social structures. So what about a woman who wasn't part of this labor system at all? What about the far larger number of women living in ordinary households in villages and towns across the empire whose lives never generated a single clay tablet? Here, the evidence gets thinner, and historians have to be honest about that. We know from a combination of archaeological remains, comparative evidence from neighboring cultures, and the scattered observations of Greek writers who need to be read with real caution given their outsider perspective and, in some cases, open hostility toward Persia, that the household was the center of most ordinary women's daily labor. That likely meant food preparation, textile production for the family's own use, water collection, childcare, and the maintenance of the home itself, much of it in a domestic space built around a central courtyard, which provided shade, airflow, and a degree of privacy from the street. Persian houses, especially outside the grand palatial centers, were typically built from mud brick, a material that was cheap, locally available, and remarkably effective at insulating against the region's extreme temperature swings. A woman managing such a household would have spent much of her day moving between shaded interior spaces and a working courtyard, timing physically demanding tasks like grinding grain or baking around the punishing midday heat, often concentrating the heaviest labor into the cooler hours of early morning and evening. Water itself was its own daily undertaking. In many Persian settlements, water arrived not from a river running conveniently past the house, but through Qanats, a remarkable engineering system of gently sloping underground tunnels that carried groundwater from higher elevations down to farms and towns, sometimes over dozens of kilometers, without a single pump. Someone in the household, frequently a woman or a child, would have been responsible for the daily task of collecting water from a local access point, a job that, depending on the settlement, could mean anything from a short walk to a genuinely significant portion of the morning. It's worth pausing on how different this rhythm is from a modern day. There was no faucet, no refrigerator to store yesterday's food safely, no stove that ignited at the turn of a dial. Nearly everything that a modern household achieves in seconds, Persian women achieved through sustained, skilled physical labor, repeated daily for an entire lifetime, and yet it would be a mistake to imagine this life as purely one of grinding drudgery, because the same textile skills that produced a family's clothing also produced some of the most economically valuable goods in the ancient world. Persian and broader Near Eastern textiles, dyed wool, patterned weaves were traded across enormous distances. A skilled weaver wasn't just clothing her household. In many cases, she was producing goods that carried real value in a wider economy, whether traded locally or absorbed into the tribute and taxation systems that fed the empire's wealth. There's also the question of what life looked like at the very top of Persian society, because this is where the historical record, ironically, becomes both richer and more distorted at the same time. Elite Persian women, particularly royal women, appear far more often in surviving sources, but almost always filtered through a male gaze, usually Greek, often written by authors who never set foot in the Persian heartland and had every incentive to portray Persian court life as decadent, secretive, or scandalous. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, and later Greek and Roman authors, describe Persian queens and royal mothers as powerful, wealthy, sometimes ruthless political operators. Some of this may reflect genuine political realities. Persian administrative texts do confirm that royal women, including queens and the mothers of kings, controlled substantial personal estates, complete with their own administrators, workshops, and revenue streams, entirely separate from the crown's treasury. A queen mother could, in a very real economic sense, run an operation comparable to a small province. But historians urge real caution before taking Greek portrayals of Persian royal women at face value. These accounts often say more about Greek anxieties, particularly Athenian anxieties about female political influence, than about verified Persian reality. Where Persian administrative records exist alongside these Greek narratives, the two don't always agree, and scholars like Maria Brosius and Pierre Briant have spent considerable effort separating documented economic fact from literary exaggeration, designed to make Persia look foreign and excessive to a Greek audience defining itself in opposition to it. So here is where an honest answer to our question has to sit. An ordinary Persian woman's day was overwhelmingly physical, structured around a household that had to produce nearly everything it consumed, from flour to cloth to water, using tools and techniques that would look punishingly slow to a modern eye. A woman working within the empire's formal labor economy might spend her day grinding grain in a state-run facility, weaving in a textile workshop, or even overseeing dozens of other women as a paid supervisor, drawing a documented wage in an economic system that, at least on paper, counted her contribution. And a woman born into the Persian elite might command estates, administer property, and wield genuine economic influence, even if the loudest surviving descriptions of her life come from outsiders with their own agenda. What almost none of these women had, at any level of society, was leisure in the way we understand it today. There was no real boundary between a day off and a working day, no separation between home and workplace in the modern sense, because the household itself was the workplace, every single day, for essentially every year of adult life. And maybe that's the detail worth carrying with you. We live in a world that has, almost invisibly, outsourced nearly every task that once defined a Persian woman's entire day. Water arrives through a pipe. Grain arrives already milled, in a bag, from a store that didn't exist for most of human history. Cloth arrives finished, cut, and sewn, often manufactured on the other side of the planet by people we will never meet. Every one of those conveniences replaced hours, sometimes the majority of a waking day, that a Persian woman would have spent doing that exact task herself, by hand, using knowledge passed down and refined over generations. It's easy to look at ancient history and see only kings and armies, because that's what survives most loudly, carved into stone and celebrated in monuments built to be remembered. But underneath every one of those monuments was an economy that had to be fed, clothed, and sustained, and an enormous share of that labor was performed by women whose names, in most cases, we will never know. A handful of clay tablets, never meant to last, are one of the only reasons we know their work as clearly as we do it all. So the next time flour appears in your kitchen without a single hour of grinding, or water arrives without a single trip to a well, it might be worth remembering that for most of human history, and for the empire that once stretched from Europe to India, that convenience was somebody's entire morning.